I will be with you whatever. Of the 2.6 million words in the Chilcot Report, these were perhaps the most damning. They were written in 2002 by the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair to American President George W. Bush. Critics have seized on the words as proof that Blair had decided to back an American invasion of Iraq long before British Parliament had given their support. When the Chilcot Report was released on Wednesday, Full Scottish went to London to get political reaction and get an answer to the question, how can we hold Blair to account for an unjustified war in which thousands of people died?
First of all, it's been a historic day at Westminster. Do you think that Westminster has risen to the occasion?
I don't think so. There was a strangely muted atmosphere in the chamber. I felt the Prime Minister's statement was a bit wishy-washy, and I think a lot of MPs are concerned to cover their own backs, and I think some of them very genuinely feel that they probably made the wrong decision, but also probably genuinely feel they didn't have the full information. But I don't feel the chamber rose to the occasion today. I think the only person who really got their teeth into the report in terms of the big speeches was Angus.
It's a curious thing because I was locked in this morning in the Cabinet office with Alex Salmond and one of our staff colleagues, and we had 3 hours to look at the report. I've got the executive summary in front of me here, and even that is quite a detailed document. The full report is volumes and volumes, and it's a difficult thing when you have such a limited period of time to go through such a literally voluminous series of documents, to pick out what's really important. And the thing that jumped out at me, and I've opened the executive summary at the page where it says this, where it is reporting that in September 2002, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair wrote to the American President Bush and said, and I quote, "I will be with you whatever."
Well, I think it's strange enough, if we're looking for an absolute killer punch, then it comes out the words of Tony Blair as opposed to out the words of John Chilcot. In fact, I brought it along because Chilcot reveals for the first time the correspondence, the secret letters taking place between Blair and Bush. And Blair was writing a lot of these memos, memo to the American president. He wrote one on the 28th of July 2002, which will be his undoing. It starts off with the lines, "I will be with you whatever." Now, that was at a time when he was telling the House of Commons that he was striving manfully to avoid war. He was doing everything he possibly could. He was going down the United Nations route. He was confronting the weapons of mass destruction issue in a collective way, and doing everything possible to protect the peace. But in private, he's telling George Bush that he's going to war come what may.
Tony Blair had said to George W. Bush that regardless of the justification, regardless of the case, regardless of the legality, he would fit his argument to justify what he wanted to do, which was to sign up to American military intervention. It wasn't just what he said, it was you had the planning allocation of British forces months and months before it was agreed in Parliament. So he knew the direction that he was going.
The questions that are being asked, particularly the question asked by Alex Salmond, was, should Blair be held to account?
Taking a country to war is the most serious decision that a politician can make. Therefore, you need to know that you have prepared for the conflict, that you have prepared for the aftermath, and it strikes me that none of this was done with devastating impact for the people of Iraq.
The United Kingdom government are accused of undermining the authority of the United Nations Security Council. That's a really grave charge. And the former Prime Minister Tony Blair is accused of taking the United Kingdom to war prematurely when he hadn't exhausted all diplomatic options. Again, that's a very grave charge. And it's a particularly grave charge when you look at not only the number of British servicemen and women who died, but also the vast number of Iraqi civilians who've died, and the mess that still pertains in Iraq when we saw what happened just a few days ago.
And one thing a Prime Minister can't do is mislead Parliament. Now, You might get away with it if it was an argument about a health service statistic or an argument about an unemployment thing or an economic trend, but this is about peace and war. This is about 179 British dead, 200,000 Iraqis, the Middle East in flames, and the rest of us living with the ever-present threat of world terrorism directly as a result of Tony Blair's decision making. So you don't tell lies about peace or war. You don't mislead Parliament on peace and war, and therefore within the contents of the Chilcot Report, Tony Blair stands indicted.
It was a disaster in foreign policy terms because the destabilisation effect in Iraq has led us to the place that we are now, one of the most unstable countries in the Middle East, which is significantly occupied by Daesh, by the so-called Islamic State group, and that is a direct result of British and American military intervention with little or no plans to stabilise that country after the intervention.
Part of our job then daily is to be accountable to the people. You know, you do that through social media, you do that through speaking to people as much as you can and showing them the job they're doing. That is something that we all have to be doing, and we all have to be open and accountable for our decisions. But Iraq, not least for those who voted for the war in Iraq, and I'm glad that my party didn't vote for the war in Iraq, need to reflect upon the devastating mistakes that have been made, and sometimes they shouldn't be surprised when there's kickback from the public, as the campaign "Not in My Name" around the time of the Iraq War so aptly demonstrated.
Well, the Chilcot Report says that the intelligence wasn't clear, that the decision-making process wasn't right, the intelligence should have been challenged, but it also says, of course, it was presented in the wrong way, that they mixed up Tony Blair's opinion, which may well have been there were weapons of mass destruction, with the intelligence facts, which were much less clear. That doesn't get Blair off the hook. You know, he could have thought that there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq all he liked, but the reality is he'd told George Bush, A, he was after regime change, and B, he was with him come what may. Unfortunately, he told the UN weapons inspectors they wouldn't get the time they asked for, and he wasn't willing to even receive the intelligence or arguments which countered the accepted wisdom that the WMD must be there. Chilcot makes a highly telling point. He says that faced with exactly the same evidence, Robin Cook came to exactly the opposite conclusion, because he was determined to follow processes properly, and above all not to subvert the processes of the United Nations, which Tony Blair did.
There's another really strong quote in relation to the intelligence, which it's one of the few areas where there's a word is underlined, and that relates to the fact that there was not evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And we overlook that now because, we're now not overlooking it now. Some of us weren't overlooking it at the time, and it wasn't just the SNP. Of course, there were other people who were opposing things at Westminster on all political sides. Robin Cook, we shouldn't forget the strong case that he made at that time. And if you remember, people who were opposing involvement in Iraq were being vilified, both in Parliament and by certain newspapers, and it was definitely swimming against a tide that was being whipped up by a Prime Minister who then was still in his communicative pomp and able to, in his own mind, persuade everybody, a bit like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, to follow him on this disaster, and that's exactly what happened.
It was harder hitting than I expected it to be, and I stress I've only skim-read the summary, but I watched Chilcot's statement just after 11 o'clock this morning, and I felt that was harder hitting than I expected it to be. You know, making the statement that Blair undermined, the United Kingdom undermined the authority of the United Nations Security Council. That's a big statement. Saying that he went to war prematurely before exhausting all diplomatic options. Saying that the dossier, and I quote, was presented with a certainty that was not justified. I mean, that is reserved language for saying the dossier was sexed up. Andrew Gilligan is now very much vindicated on that one.
Not according to Arthur Campbell, who says that it was. He said specifically, it's not sexed up. As Tony Blair specifically said, there's no connection between the Iraq War and the subsequent growth in Daesh and the terrorism that we see today.
Well, I mean, people can work it out for themselves. Again, look at what Chilcot says. The dossier was presented with a certainty that was not justified. I mean, that is reserved civil service speak for the dossier was sexed up. And I think Chilcot also says elsewhere there was evidence, which people like the late Robin Cook founded on in his famous speech in the Chamber. There was evidence to suggest that in fact there were no weapons of mass destruction, and that evidence wasn't covered in the dossier.
So you reject completely Tony Blair's argument that in fact there's no connection between the events leading up to the Iraq War and more recent events of...
That's a patent nonsense. It's because we have ungoverned spaces that the extremist groups have been able to fill that geographical or political gap. And if you have a look at the sectarian nature of the forces that were unleashed after the military involvement between Shiite and Sunni Muslims in Iraq, and the various power structures, and not least from the former governing Ba'athist powers, there is a direct line between turfing out one group of elites, then having a power vacuum, and then sectarian conflict, and this group emerging from the same kind of horrific extreme ideology as Al-Qaeda. And there is a direct link. There is no denying it, much as Tony Blair might try. He can wriggle as much as he likes, but I think most people in the country have got the measure of his responsibility about what happened then, and the inheritance that the poor people of Iraq are having to pay for the decisions that Tony Blair and George W. Bush reached in private between the two of them.
Do you think an apology from Tony Blair is enough, or do you think that solves it, or makes it better, or is that a worthwhile thing to look for?
His decisions have had a devastating impact on Iraq. Have had a devastating impact on the families of service personnel who were caught up in that conflict. I think that we need to take time, 2.5 million words, have a look, but I think there has to be some kind of accountability.
Well, I mean, he's taken total responsibility and then told everybody to do the same thing again. And it's in that phrase, I would do the same thing again, that is the clue to further action. Now, legal action is problematic. It's problematic for the International Criminal Court because, unfortunately, the crime of aggression is not yet tested by that court. It won't be until at least next year. A pity, because Chilcot has acres of stuff on why this was a crime of aggression, an unjustified war. The domestic criminal legal remedies in England, they've already, high courts have decided they'll only take international law into the domestic law if there's a specific instrument of Parliament. The question in Scotland is much more open, incidentally, but nonetheless the Scottish courts might follow that same argument. Civil action by the families, I think, will be strengthened by the Chilcot Report. There's plenty in here about how poor decision making and preparation through inadequate equipment led to the deaths of servicemen and therefore servicewomen. Therefore, families' case, if they take a civil case, will be strengthened. But I think the compelling argument is for parliamentary action. It was Parliament who Blair was selling one line to while he was saying something else in private to George Bush. It was Parliament who were persuaded to go to war on a false premise and a false pretext, and it was Parliament who were persuaded to sanction the Prime Minister in undermining the authority of the United Nations. And so hopefully it should be Parliament that finds the guts and the gumption across the political parties to say, look, a lot of this, as Chilcot finds, is about the processes of Blair government, about not going through the correct procedures, about keeping Cabinet in the dark, about not having collective decision making, and no doubt lots of that can be sorted for the future. But at the end of the day, it's not the processes of government that make decisions, it's individuals that make decisions, and it was Tony Blair who made these decisions, and therefore that individual, that Prime Minister, that Tony Blair should be called to account, and in doing so is the only way of making sure that something like Iraq is never allowed to happen again.
I suppose there's two ways in which Mr. Blair could be held to account. He could be held to account politically, or he could be held to account legally, or of course both could be done. Mr. Blair, unlike the rest of us, has had the luxury of having advanced sight of the report and several weeks to pore over it with his legal advisors. And we've seen his defence this afternoon that he acted in good faith, which I don't think is really in keeping with the fact that we know that he said very early on to George Bush, "I'll be with you whatever." And if you look at the full context of that note where he says, "I'll be with you whatever," he's clearly talking about regime change. "I'll be with you whatever," and getting rid of Saddam. So as to how he could be held to account, international criminal law is a really specialist area, and it was not an area which I practiced in when I was at the bar. But I've read a bit about it and consulted a couple of people who are more expert in the area. And there are various options open on the legal front. As you probably know, the International Criminal Court has said that it may investigate war crimes perpetrated by British service people in Iraq, but that it's not interested in investigating Mr. Blair per se. And I think the reason for that is that what Mr. Blair would be accused of is the crime of aggression, which at the moment is not part of the rule book at the International Criminal Court, although they're about to amend it, but the amendment won't be retrospective. Right. So I think the International Criminal Court avenue looks like it's closing down. At the weekend, my colleague Alex Salmond talked about the possibility of Mr. Blair being tried in a Scottish court. And I think the thinking behind that is that the crime of aggression is recognised as part of what's known as international customary criminal law. But there's authority from the House of Lords, which preceded the Supreme Court in England or across the UK, that in England and Wales at least, the crime of aggression is not part of the law of England and Wales, so nobody could be prosecuted in an English or Welsh court for the crime of aggression in this international criminal context. But there's no authority from any Scottish court as to whether or not that could be done in Scotland. So I suppose it's open for discussion as to whether it could be done in Scotland. It could be done in England and Wales if the British Parliament passed a statute to change the law.
Who could do it in Scotland? Could it be the families? Or does it need to be somebody who's got a direct relationship with it? Or could...
Well, if we're talking about a criminal action, of course in Scotland it's the Lord Advocate who prosecutes in the name of the Crown, and so the police would require to investigate and a report would require to be made to the Procurator Fiscal, and then the Lord Advocate would require to consider whether or not there should be a prosecution. And as I say, it appears open as at least a possibility that could happen. To be frank, I don't see that happening, but it's a possibility. I think what really needs to happen, I think, is for this Parliament, the British Parliament, to hold Mr. Blair to account. You know, he's a former British Prime Minister. A report commissioned by another former British Prime Minister has found that he took the country to war without a proper purpose, and that in doing so he undermined the authority of the United Kingdom Supreme Court. So I think it's really the Parliament that needs to hold him to account. And there's been talk of impeachment, which is quite an old-fashioned process, whether or not that would work. But of course it would be open to this Parliament to pass a statute modernising the process of impeachment. And people might say that's complicated, but the rules, for example, the rules applying to English votes for English laws are pretty complicated, but they went through this Parliament pretty quickly, in the space of less than a year. So if this is serious enough, then the British Parliament could look at finding some way of holding Mr. Blair to account if one does not exist already. But just to get back to the legal stuff, I was very much focusing there on the prospect of a criminal prosecution. It is, of course, open to the families of servicemen and servicewomen who died in Iraq to look at civil actions for damages. I think that's been done already, courtesy of the Human Rights Act, in relation to people who died as a result or were injured as a result of having inadequate equipment.
Mm-hmm. To hold the government to account, because more often than not, unfortunately, that's not done by the official opposition. The Labour Party is incapable of doing it. And I don't know if you had the chance to watch Prime Minister's questions, but Jeremy Corbyn didn't ask a single question, not one, about the Chilcot inquiry. This within an hour of John Chilcot having published his report, having spoken about it, and the first opportunity for the Prime Minister to be put on the spot and ask questions. So he didn't ask about it, no. So I did.
To be fair, Corbyn had spoken out against it, in the past, but weirdly today.
But this is the issue with Jeremy Corbyn, who I like as a person and I've known for a long time. He no doubt has great strengths, and so, for example, we have a totally shared position on Trident and our opposition to its renewal. But Jeremy Corbyn is not a great parliamentary performer, and that's not a cardinal sin in itself, of course not. But if you're going to be the leader of an opposition party, you have to be choosing the right questions to hold the government to account, to be effective. And I would imagine if you want to be a functioning opposition, official opposition party, and it fails on all counts. So it just falls to us to do the right thing and ask the right questions. And today, the right thing to ask was about Chilcot, and I did that. And I think I put the Prime Minister on the spot about something that he didn't even mention in his statement. And I think it's really important that we understand that Tony Blair's position was that I will be with you, whatever. I think people need to know that. And so we put that marker down, and then we did it later in the statement and the exchanges on the Chilcot Report. So we're just doing our job.
When a report is as critical as this report of politicians who are supposed to be accountable to the people, then there should be some accountability. And what worries me is there didn't seem to be any strong will on the floor of the House today, apart from the SNP and a few backbenchers, Tory backbenchers, and perhaps the Lib Dems, in fairness to them, to see Blair held to account for this. There was embarrassment. I think there are people who regret the way that they voted and perhaps feel that they had the wool pulled over their eyes. But I wouldn't wish to be too critical of ordinary backbenchers in that respect. I think, the culprits here are people at the top, people who went to war when there wasn't a proper ground for going to war, the people who flew in the face of the United Nations Security Council, the people who set out to help America at all costs, the man who said, "I will be with you whatever," at a very early stage in the proceedings, and whose aim was regime change. I mean, of course, there are many regimes in the world which would be better off without. But the United Nations exists for a reason, and if countries like the United Kingdom disrespect the United Nations without any consequences, then that undermines the whole force and the whole effect of the United Nations.
The aftermath has shown just how difficult the international community have found it to come together over Syria, for instance, which has direct consequences harking back to Iraq, in what is another brutal, devastating civil war that's claiming far too many fatalities and destroying too many communities and too many lives. But you see that where the international community has been undermined, and also with our European partners. And this ties in with Brexit a little bit, because for me, the long-term planning is critical. And actually, if you look even back, go further back, and you look at the Western Balkans, it is only 20-25 years on from the end of that conflict that you start to see the fruit of long-term investment in rebuilding the economies in the Western Balkans. And I hope that they join the European Union, and I hope that Scotland's a member to welcome them into the European Union, because the EU can be a soft superpower, and it's that soft power that prevents conflicts and also rebuilds after conflicts, but is a long-term investment. And I think that, as well as the legacy of Iraq being damaging for that, I think Brexit could be potentially damaging for that as well if we don't handle it carefully. I mean, the United Nations is the sum of its parts, is that it is dependent on the will of its member states. So I think that, in due course, maybe the United Nations needs to be more reflective of the world in which we live in today. But I think to blame the United Nations as an organisation for mistakes that were made by the Americans, by the UK government and others is probably a little bit unfair.
It would have to be cross-party. You have to have that sort of arrangement whereby people are looking at this in a parliamentary sense as opposed to a party political sense. Some of that, I think, didn't look good in the debate. When the Labour are looking upon the Iraq as a pro and anti-Corbyn thing. I mean, it's unbelievable that people, despite presentation of this report, are still talking as if, well, we were quite right to vote for the war anyway. Unbelievable. And it's because Labour have got themselves into a mentality they have to defend the indefensible because they're taking sides with Tony Blair against Jeremy Corbyn. It's ludicrous. But there will be some Labour MPs who are prepared to take a different line. There's certainly some Conservatives who said, look, we were misled. If I had known this, clearly I wouldn't have voted for unjustified war. And then, of course, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru and the SDLP are have always had a consistent anti-war position. So there will be, I think and hope, a cross-party framework, and it has to be done on a cross-party basis, and we have to find a mechanism to hold this man to account. Discussions are already taking place, but quite rightly people wanted to wait until we saw the report, and we want to examine the report in detail. I mean, I was given 3 hours notice this morning. I worked out that that was 14,000 words a minute to get the whole thing read. So, you know, even I haven't read the whole report, but I've been able to read more of it than most. But people want to examine it in detail. They want the parliamentary debate on an adjournment motion for next week, and then people will talk and consider what proper parliamentary instruments can be used to bring this man to account.